She looked at me with longing in her eyes and whispered, "I miss being desired. Can you help me?" What began as a simple gesture would change everything between us. It was one of those perfect summer evenings when everything seems a little quieter, a little more still. The sun was dipping low, casting a soft golden light over the neighborhood. I had just finished my run and was catching my breath on the steps of my apartment building when I noticed her. She wasn't someone I'd ever really paid attention to before. My neighbor's aunt, Catherine. I'd seen her around a few times, always with a quiet, confident air about her, but that was the extent of it. I hadn't thought much of her until that evening. She was standing outside my neighbor's gate, just for a moment, almost as if she was lost in thought. The light from the setting sun caught the silver in her hair, making it glow. There was something about the way she carried herself, a quiet strength that seemed at odds with the peaceful surroundings. She wasn't trying to stand out, but she did. I could feel it even from a distance. When our eyes met, it was brief, but it felt like everything slowed down. She had this look, like she was seeing right through me, like she knew something I didn't. For a second, I couldn't look away. Then I quickly turned my attention to the keys in my hand, trying to act normal, pretending like I hadn't noticed the subtle way her gaze lingered on mine. I wasn't sure what it was, maybe it was her age, maybe it was the way she seemed so different from anyone I'd ever known, but I felt something. Not just the usual passing glance you give a neighbor. There was an electricity in the air between us, something unspoken, something neither of us wanted to name yet. She gave me a small smile, just enough to be polite, but there was a little something behind it that made me wonder if she was as aware of the moment as I was. Then she turned away, walking towards the house, but not before I caught the smallest hint of sadness in her eyes. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt drawn to her. Something about the way she moved, the quiet weight she carried in her presence. It wasn't the kind of thing you could explain, and definitely not something I had ever expected to feel. There was no obvious reason for it. She was older, and I was just a guy trying to figure things out. But as I stood there on those steps, watching her disappear into the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Maybe it was just curiosity, maybe it was more. Either way, I knew I'd be thinking about her long after that evening was over. The days after our first meeting passed quietly, almost like nothing had shifted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set in motion. It was as if the brief, lingering moment between us had somehow opened a door, and I was now left wondering whether I should step through. It was a few weeks later when I found myself on the small balcony of my apartment, looking out at the evening sky. The sun was low again, casting a warm glow across the quiet street. I'd just finished working and had a few minutes to myself before heading to the kitchen for dinner. That's when I saw her again. She was walking up the steps to her niece's house, the same calm, confident presence about her. But this time, something was different. There was a softness in her that hadn't been there before, a vulnerability that I hadn't noticed. I stood there, unsure if I should say something, but she spotted me and smiled. "Hello again," she said, her voice warm, yet there was a tiredness underneath it. I offered a smile in return. "Hey, Catherine. How's everything?" She paused for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. There was a hesitation in her eyes, something I wasn't used to seeing. Catherine was always composed, but now, there was an openness in her gaze. "I've been better," she said with a small, rueful laugh. "You know, life, it just doesn't slow down, does it?" I nodded, unsure of what to say. There was something in her voice that caught my attention. It wasn't just small talk. There was a weight to it. She wasn't just going through the motions, she was speaking with a quiet honesty that felt almost too personal. "I miss being desired, you know," she said, her eyes drifting down to the ground for a moment, as if the words had slipped out before she could stop them. "Not just in the way that people admire you, but really, deeply wanted, in the way you used to feel when you were younger. Do you know what I mean?" Her words caught me off guard. They were so honest, so raw, and they hung in the air between us. I didn't know how to respond right away. I wasn't sure if she even expected an answer. It felt like a confession, one that was as much about herself as it was about the quiet ache she was sharing. "I think I understand," I said finally, my voice softer than I intended. "I can imagine how that feels." She gave a small, almost sad smile. "It's hard to keep that part of yourself alive when the world doesn't seem to notice anymore." I could see the weight of those words in the way her shoulders sagged slightly. The confident woman I had seen before now seemed more fragile, less certain. And in that moment, I understood something about her I hadn't before. This wasn't just about desire, it was about longing. Not for something fleeting, but for a connection, a feeling of being seen, truly seen, by someone who understood. The moment passed, but the silence lingered, leaving a deep, unspoken understanding between us. I couldn't help but wonder how much more there was beneath the surface of this woman I was only beginning to know. Days went by, each one folding into the next, but something had shifted inside me after that first encounter with Catherine. The brief moment of connection lingered in my thoughts like a melody I couldn't quite place. And while the days seemed to follow their usual rhythm, there was an unspoken curiosity in the air between us, one that neither of us acknowledged outright but still seemed to hum just beneath the surface. It wasn't until a week later, on a quiet evening, when I found myself unexpectedly face to face with her again. I had been sitting on my balcony, letting the cool breeze of the evening settle around me as I sipped on a glass of water, watching the sky turn into shades of deep purple. The world was slowing down, the kind of stillness that begged for reflection. That's when I saw her. Catherine was walking down the street towards her niece's house, and for the first time, I noticed how the weight of her years seemed to rest on her shoulders more heavily than before. She walked slowly, almost as though lost in her thoughts, but when her eyes met mine from across the street, she gave me that same warm, familiar smile. This time, though, there was something more behind it, a quiet sadness that hadn't been there before. I stood, feeling an almost magnetic pull to cross that invisible boundary between us. I wasn't sure why, but I found myself stepping toward her as she approached. "Hey, Catherine," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, though I could feel the undercurrent of something deeper. "Hey, yourself," she replied, her voice soft but warm. She paused, glancing up at the sky, then back at me. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" I nodded, though the words felt trivial in the moment. The air between us felt different now, heavier, somehow. We stood there for a moment in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but rather thick with unspoken understanding. She sighed softly, a deep, almost imperceptible sound. "You know, I've been thinking a lot lately," she began, and I could hear the vulnerability in her tone. "About what it means to feel desired. Really desired. Not just in the casual, passing way people look at you, but in a way that makes you feel seen." Her words hung in the air between us, fragile but raw. It was as though she hadn't meant to say them out loud, but once they were spoken, they seemed to reveal something deeper about her, something she hadn't shared with anyone in a long time. "I miss that feeling," she continued, her gaze drifting downward, almost as if the admission was too much to carry. "The way it used to be when I was younger. When someone's touch or their gaze made you feel important. Not just another face in the crowd." I watched her closely as she spoke, noticing the way her eyes flickered with a faint sadness, the slight tremor in her voice. It wasn't a cry for attention, it was an honest, quiet longing, a desire for something that had slipped through her fingers over time. "I think I understand," I said softly, though I wasn't sure if I really did. How could I? I was young, still trying to figure out the complexities of my own emotions, let alone someone else's. But there was something about the way she looked at me then, as though she were searching for understanding in my eyes. It made my heart ache in a way I couldn't explain. She smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I suppose it's silly, really. But you don't always realize what you've lost until it's gone." Her words hung in the air, heavier than the evening breeze, and I felt a deep pull to offer something, to say something to ease the quiet pain I could feel radiating from her. But I held back, unsure of how to step into a conversation so fraught with unspoken histories and desires. Instead, I simply nodded, letting the quiet weight of the moment settle between us. This wasn't just about desire, it was about being seen, being wanted in a way that made you feel alive. And in that instant, I realized that Catherine wasn't just longing for someone to notice her, she was longing for someone to truly understand her, to give her the attention she'd been missing for so long. The moment stretched on, and as she finally turned to head inside, I couldn't help but feel that something had irrevocably shifted between us. What had started as a casual neighborly exchange was now something deeper, more complex, an unspoken understanding that neither of us was ready to name, but both of us felt. After that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about Catherine. There was something about her, something that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. It wasn't just the words she said, it was the weight behind them, the quiet vulnerability that she seemed to carry in every gesture. I found myself looking for moments when I might see her again, even though I wasn't sure why. A few days later, we crossed paths again in the hallway of our apartment building. I had just stepped out to grab the mail, and there she was, walking in from the parking lot, her steps measured, as always, but this time, there was a softness in her movements that caught my attention. She wasn't in a hurry, and she didn't have the usual confident air she wore like a second skin. She was, for a moment, just a woman, tired, reflective, maybe even a little lost. When she saw me, she smiled, and this time, there was no hesitation in her eyes, no forced pleasantries. It was as if she, too, had been thinking about our last conversation. "Hey there," she said, her voice warm but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Hi, Catherine," I replied, my heart suddenly beating faster for reasons I wasn't prepared for. There was an energy between us, subtle yet undeniable, and I couldn't ignore the pull. As we spoke, I noticed how close we were, standing there in the narrow hallway. She was just a few steps away, her presence filling the small space in a way that felt intimate without being overt. There was a quiet kind of tension in the air, something neither of us was willing to acknowledge aloud. And then, it happened, her hand brushed against mine. It wasn't an accident, I could tell. It was deliberate, gentle, and somehow, it felt like it was meant to happen. The soft pressure of her fingers against mine sent a shock of warmth through me, and for a split second, I forgot to breathe. She didn't pull away immediately, leaving her hand resting just long enough for the sensation to sink in. It was so subtle, so quiet, that if anyone had been watching, they probably wouldn't have noticed. But to me, it felt like everything. My pulse quickened, my senses heightened, and the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the feeling of her hand against mine. Her touch was light but intentional, like she was reaching out to see if I would respond, if I would meet her halfway. There was something deeply intimate in that brief moment, a shared connection that didn't need words. It was as if her hand had spoken a language we both understood, even if we weren't ready to acknowledge it. She slowly pulled her hand back, and the space between us felt suddenly larger. But the warmth of that touch lingered in the air, in my fingertips, in my chest. I stood there for a moment, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed to fit. I was afraid that any attempt to break the silence would shatter the fragile connection we had just shared. I started, but she interrupted me with a soft, knowing smile. "It's okay," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I'll see you around." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the hallway, heart racing, thoughts swirling. I couldn't help but wonder what that touch had meant. Had it been a gesture of comfort, or something more? Something that hinted at what we both seemed to feel but weren't yet willing to admit? As I stood there, I realized that I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that whatever this connection was, it was slowly starting to take shape in a way neither of us could ignore. A week passed since that quiet touch in the hallway, and I could still feel it lingering in my chest every time I thought about Catherine. There was a part of me that wanted to push past the hesitation, to cross that invisible line between us and finally admit what was quietly growing beneath the surface. But another part of me, the part that had always been cautious, told me to wait. To let things unfold on their own. Then, one evening, I found myself sitting in my apartment, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, there she was, Catherine, standing on the other side, a warm smile on her face, holding a small potted plant in her hands. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought you might like this," she said, her voice light but carrying a hint of something deeper. "It's a peace lily. They're supposed to bring good energy." I couldn't help but smile at the gesture. It was simple, but there was something about it that felt personal, as if she was offering more than just a plant. I stepped aside to let her in, and we settled at the small table by the window. The evening light was soft, casting a warm glow over everything, and for the first time in a while, the silence between us didn't feel awkward. We chatted casually at first, about the usual things, work, the weather, how her niece was doing, but I could sense that there was something she wanted to say. She seemed more restless than usual, her words coming slower, almost as if she was searching for the right ones. Finally, after a moment of silence, she put down her teacup and looked at me, her eyes soft but intense. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her voice quieter now. "About what I said the other day, about missing being desired." I stayed quiet, letting her speak, but inside, my heart was racing. I knew this moment had been coming. There was a raw honesty in her voice, a vulnerability that was impossible to ignore. She exhaled softly, looking down at her hands before meeting my gaze again. "I didn't mean to burden you with that, but it's been on my mind. It's just, sometimes I feel like I've been invisible for too long. Like the world sees me as someone past my time." The honesty in her words hit me harder than I expected. I had known there was something beneath the surface, an ache she carried with her, but hearing it out loud made it real. I wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the weight in her voice, but I couldn't find the words at first. Instead, I just looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman who had been hiding behind that quiet confidence. "I don't think you're invisible," I said finally, my voice softer than usual. "I think you're more than most people can see." There was a long pause. She searched my face for a moment before offering a small, sincere smile. "Thank you," she whispered, and I knew, in that moment, that something had shifted between us. The walls had come down, and we were no longer two strangers. We were two people sharing something real, something raw, that neither of us had expected. And in that silence, I felt closer to her than ever before. After that evening, something changed between Catherine and me. There was no immediate declaration, no sudden shifts in behavior, but we both knew. The air between us had thickened, charged with a tension that neither of us was willing to name yet. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was palpable, present in every conversation, in every glance that lingered just a moment too long. We had reached a place of unspoken understanding, and though I wasn't sure where it would lead, I couldn't ignore the pull between us. Our interactions became more frequent, though they still held that quiet quality. We saw each other often now, sometimes in passing, sometimes more intentionally. I would find her sitting outside on her balcony, a book in hand, her eyes tracing the words but never quite reading them. I'd stop by for a moment, just to chat, and we'd exchange the usual pleasantries, but there was always an undercurrent of something more. One evening, as the sky began to fade into twilight, I found her sitting alone in the small garden behind her apartment building. It was a quiet spot, tucked away from the rest of the world, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people left. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, my voice tentative, though the invitation was there. She looked up from her book, and her eyes met mine with that same softness I had come to recognize. There was a warmth there, a welcome, but also something deeper, something uncertain. "Of course," she replied, her voice calm but carrying a trace of something else, something I couldn't quite place. I sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance at first, but the closeness felt natural. As we talked about little things, books, the weather, plans for the weekend, the conversation felt like it had before, but this time, it was different. There was something unspoken hanging between us, in the way our words filled the space, in the way our gazes met and held for just a heartbeat longer than usual. The tension was subtle, but it was there. I could feel it in the way her body seemed to lean just a fraction closer when she spoke, how her hand rested near mine, almost touching but never quite. She didn't pull away when I shifted slightly, and neither did I. And then, without thinking, I reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it felt like a declaration. My fingers lingered for a moment on her skin, soft and warm, before I withdrew them quickly, unsure of what I was doing. She didn't pull away. In fact, she seemed to lean into the touch ever so slightly, her eyes holding mine as though waiting for something. My heart raced, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade around us, leaving just the two of us, sitting there in the soft light, connected by something neither of us had the words for. I started, but she stopped me with a soft smile, her eyes full of understanding. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I know." And in that moment, everything seemed to align. The tension, the unspoken words, the feelings we had both been holding back, it all felt like it was building to something. But for now, we stayed there, in that quiet, unspoken understanding, just a little closer than before. The weeks that followed felt like a slow, inevitable build-up. Every time I saw Catherine, the tension between us grew, silent but undeniable. It was as though the universe was urging us toward something we weren't quite ready to acknowledge. Our interactions, always thoughtful and meaningful, had become almost too charged. And then, one evening, it happened, something neither of us had planned but that felt completely natural in the moment. It was late, and the night had settled in with a quiet stillness. I had just finished my work for the day and decided to step out for a walk to clear my head. The night air was cool, but the warmth of the evening still clung to the streets. As I rounded the corner of the building, I spotted Catherine standing by her balcony, the soft glow from her apartment casting a warm light around her. "Hey," I called, a little too loudly, as if I was trying to make my presence known. She turned toward me, a gentle smile crossing her face as her eyes met mine. She looked different tonight, softer somehow, as if something had changed within her, as if she had reached a place where she was ready to take a step forward. "Hey," she replied, her voice quieter than usual, as if she too could feel the shift in the air. "Come up." I hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. I made my way up to her apartment, the silence between us stretching out like a taut rope, neither of us wanting to break it, but knowing it was going to snap soon. When I walked through the door, it was as if we were both drawn together by some unseen force. The words we had spoken over the past few weeks had laid the groundwork, and now, in this small, intimate space, we were finally ready to close the distance. And so, I did. I reached out, slowly, as though giving her the space to pull away if she needed to, and cupped her cheek gently in my hand. The moment our skin touched, something inside me clicked into place. I could feel her breath hitch slightly, and I knew, without a doubt, that this was the moment we had both been waiting for. Without a word, I leaned in, and her lips met mine, soft, tentative at first, but then deepening, as if we were both trying to make up for lost time, trying to make the silence we had lived in for so long speak in this one kiss. It was everything and nothing at once, a culmination of every glance, every touch, every word we hadn't said. The kiss lingered, quiet and profound, before we pulled away, both of us breathless, as though the world had momentarily stopped turning. "I didn't think it would be like this," she whispered, her forehead resting against mine. "But it feels right." And I couldn't help but agree. It was right. It always had been. The days after that kiss felt like they were suspended in time. Neither of us rushed to label what had happened between us, but there was no denying that everything had changed. We had crossed a line, but it wasn't a line of regret, it was a line of understanding. The connection that had been building quietly between us for weeks had finally come to the surface, and now, we were left to navigate what came next. We found ourselves meeting more often, in the quiet moments when the world around us seemed to slow down. There was no need for grand gestures or overt declarations, the bond we shared spoke louder than words ever could. We spent evenings sitting together, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about our lives, our hopes, our dreams, things we had never shared with anyone else. The vulnerability that had started with that first conversation about longing had blossomed into something deeper, something unspoken but understood. One evening, as we sat together on her balcony, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky, I finally found the words I had been searching for. "I've been thinking about us," I said, my voice quiet, almost hesitant. She turned to face me, her eyes soft but steady. "Me too," she replied, her voice carrying a sense of peace. "I'm not sure where this is going," I continued, "but I know I don't want it to end here." She smiled, the kind of smile that told me she felt the same way. "I don't either," she said, her voice full of quiet certainty. I think we're just starting." In that moment, the weight of her words settled around me. We didn't need to have everything figured out right away. There was no rush. What we had was something real, something that didn't need to be defined immediately. It was about the connection we had, the understanding that had grown between us. As we sat there, side by side, hands brushing against each other, I realized that this was just the beginning of something beautiful. Whatever the future held, we would face it together, quietly, patiently, and with the certainty that we had both found something we had been longing for. And in that silence, there was a warmth, a peace, that told me we were exactly where we were meant to be.